Good evening, everyone. My name is Naki Osutei. Thank you to the Walrus Foundation and the MasterCard Foundation and the organizers of the Walrus Talks for the honor of being able to share the podium with these incredible leaders. The last time I was in this venue was in September of this year. It was another amazing evening at the Toronto International Film Festival. But this year was especially magical for me because TIFF had placed a spotlight on Lagos as part of its City to City program. I attended the film Okafor's Law with an old childhood friend who also happens to be Ghanaian like me. We sat in awe, imagining what our 4-year-old selves would have thought if we had told them that some 30 years later, that we would be sitting in a theater, part of a major international film festival, watching the type of films we would watch at home in our living rooms while getting our hair braided. This is reflective of a change in the way that we see Africa. Now, more than any other time in history, more images of Africa being shared around the world are being created by Africans. This shift can be attributed to many things, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to highlight this as one of the unintended outcomes of the digital movement across the continent. I remember a time when this wasn't the case. I stand here before you because my parents made an outrageous choice in the 70s to seek a better life for themselves and for their baby. We began our Canadian journey in a high-rise tower at Weston Road in Finch, in a community that was ethnically and culturally mixed and included families from Ghana who would periodically drop in for visits. We would have courtesy aunties and uncles come in for komo, and komo is a slang term meaning commiserate. They would komo over the state of their lives in Canada, so different than what they expected. They would komo over the state of affairs in Ghana, oscillating from a romanticized view of the country to frustration with a perceived lack of progress. The conversation would somehow always end with, well, if not for us, our children will prosper. While all this prophesying was going on, my little brother and I would be practicing our WWF moves on one another. And one of the courtesy uncles would say to me, Naki, the hippopotamus is bothered by the fly. The fly is not bothered by the hippopotamus. After we finished laughing hysterically at the pronunciation of what we Canadians would say, hippopotamus, we would stare at one another quizzically, not sure who was the fly. Fast forward to about the early 2000s. I'm working in Toronto for an organization, and my role is focused on revenue development. At the time, there's a growing interest in engaging more diverse communities in revenue development. Donors of Indian and Chinese descent are identified as targets. And I find myself in these rooms where these conversations are going on. I'm the youngest person in the room and usually the only person of color. And still, I'm simultaneously hyper-visible and yet invisible. No one asks me about other communities that can be engaged. No one asks me about my community. Fast forward a few more years. I start graduate studies, and my research is focused on multiculturalism and marketing. At the same time, the business case for diversity is growing in popularity. Businesses are finally acknowledging the benefits of having diverse teams, reflecting the communities they serve, and making connections to international markets. The key international markets of interest were the so-called emerging markets, popularly known as the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China. The message to businesses was to hire locally individuals who can help you connect to markets in these countries. Again, African nations were not on the radar, and by extension, local Africans and people of African descent were not. So when you break down these two examples, you see how Africans and people of African descent were excluded through efforts to be more inclusive. Now, I share these two examples not in any way to create polarity between already racialized and marginalized groups, but rather to acknowledge the fact that with an imperative based solely on the bottom line, you risk creating exclusions, reproducing oppressions, reinforcing stereotypes, and also missing out on innovations. You see, at the same time that this was all going on, in spite of primitive headlines like The Economist's 2000 feature story, Hopeless Africa, there was an incredible movement brewing. Between 1990 and 2010, Nigeria, for example, went from having 100,000 landlines to 100 million mobile phones. The environment was ripe for innovation along mobile lines. Economies like those in Ghana, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Nigeria grew at approximately 6% each year between 2009 and 2015, making them among the fastest growing economies in the world, and yet they were not on the radar. In terms of innovations, we start to see innovations that could have benefits to countries outside of the continent. For example, the cardiopod, created by a 24-year-old Cameroonian, diagnoses heart diseases in rural households. Can't you imagine a tool like this being used in rural Ontario? Similarly, M-Pedigree, which is a code that's placed on medicine packages, was created by a Ghanaian astrophysicist. It helps identify counterfeit medicine and helps consumers check the authenticity of a particular medicine. M-Pedigree has appeared on 6.5 million packs of medicine and is the national standard in 3 countries. It's now become the model for the industry in India. These kinds of developments in no way override the fact that there is still incredible poverty across parts of Africa and that infrastructure is still an issue. I mean, what the irony that virtually every person in Nigeria can check their Twitter feed on their mobile phone to find out when there will be light off or power outage. Yet, that doesn't diminish my optimism. I believe there's an opportunity to reverse the narrative on Africa. We are standing in a moment where innovation from Africa is going to other parts of the world and not the other way around. But there is a further opportunity to be more intentional about this. And yes, we need to worry about potential exploitation of Africa. It's already happening. And I believe that there's a role for Africans through the diaspora to act as trustees for this wisdom. Can you imagine partnerships between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent designed to promote innovations from the continent to other parts of the world, and while doing so, building the economies of Africa? This could be a new approach to thinking globally and acting locally. We can continue to reintroduce Africa through the gaze of Africans, much like the same way that Cameron Bailey and Tiff did in this very room. So, in the spirit of my courtesy uncles and aunties, I leave you with this proverb: it is a crooked wood that shows the best sculptor. Thank you.